Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, grateful to sit with you in this quiet hour. Tell me, what lingers in your evening? The soft scratch of pen on paper, the hush of rain beyond the window, or the steady comfort of lamplight? Dr. Watson often found that such moments revealed more than the day ever could. Do subscribe if you wish to return to these gentle inquiries. Now draw a little closer, for it is a capital mistake to theorise before one has data. And should you wish to listen further, you'll find Watson's Margins on Spotify. The link awaits in the description below. Chapter 1. A Quiet Title in Bloomsbury. It is a peculiarity of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most singular affairs rarely announce themselves with any fanfare. The great dramas of Baker Street, those episodes which I have endeavoured, with varying success, to set before the public, more often began with a knock at the door than with a thunderclap, with a visitor's hesitant manner than with any overt display of urgency. So it was on a mild morning in the latter days of October, when a thin autumnal sun lay across the sitting-room carpet, and Holmes reclined in his armchair with the air of a man who had found the world temporarily insufficient to hold his interest. I had come up from my rounds in good time, and had settled with the morning papers beside the fire. Holmes had not spoken in some hours. His clay pipe had gone cold in his hand, and his grey eyes were fixed upon the middle distance with that peculiar vacancy which I had learned to recognise not as idleness, but as the deepest species of concentration. He was, in short, the picture of a man who required a problem, and had not yet been furnished with one. Mrs. Hudson's footstep upon the stair, accompanied by the deliberate tread of a second party, drew us both from our respective occupations. Holmes did not move so much as a finger, though his eyes sharpened perceptibly. The gentleman who entered our sitting-room was perhaps 50 years of age, of a spare and careful figure, dressed in a well-cut but unostentatious dark coat, of the kind favoured by those professional men whose work demands respectability without extravagance. He carried a leather case, slim and fastened with brass clasps, and wore upon his face an expression I have seen many times in that room, the look of a man who has convinced himself on the way upstairs that his business is less extraordinary than it privately feels to him. "Mr. Holmes," said he, with a slight inclination of the head, "I am Edwin Harcourt of Harcourt and Vane, solicitors of Gray's Inn. I apologise for presenting myself without an appointment." "Pray sit down, Mr. Harcourt," said Holmes without rising. "You will find the basket chair tolerably comfortable. Watson, you will stay, I think." I set aside my paper. Harcourt took his seat and placed the leather case upon his knee with the attentive care of a man who has spent his professional life regarding documents as objects of consequence. "I will not waste your time with preamble," Harcourt began, then paused, as though recollecting that preamble was rather his natural idiom. "I come on a matter that may strike you, at first hearing, as trifling. I confess that it struck me so when it was first brought to my attention. Yet I find, the longer I examine it, the less trivial it appears." "That," said Holmes with the ghost of a smile, "is generally a promising beginning." Harcourt opened his case and withdrew a folded document, which he spread carefully across his knee. "My firm acts on behalf of Mr. Silas Merridew, who acquired, some 8 months ago, a freehold property in Bloomsbury, a modest terrace house in the neighbourhood of Montague Street. The conveyance was unremarkable. The property had been held by a Mr. Cornelius Vane, no relation to my partner, I should say, who died in August of last year without a direct heir. Mr. and Merridew purchased at fair market value. The transaction was submitted to the land registry in the ordinary manner. "And yet," Holmes said. Harcourt looked at him with a slight elevation of the brow. "And yet, a matter of weeks ago, a junior clerk at the Registry office noted that the ledger entry for this property does not precisely correspond to the original submission. The entry has been altered. Subtly, with considerable skill, the ink matched, the hand imitated, the seals left undisturbed. But the alteration is there if one knows where to look." I leaned forward at this. Holmes, by contrast, had not changed his posture by so much as a degree. He was watching Harcourt with the calm, steady attention of a naturalist observing a specimen of unusual interest. "What precisely was altered?" Holmes asked. "A notation regarding the terms of encumbrance on the property," Harcourt replied. "Vane had, in earlier years, entered into certain financial arrangements that left the land encumbered. The alteration in the registry removes all reference to those arrangements. In effect, whoever made the change wished to present the property as having passed to Merridew free and clear of all prior obligation." "And does Merridew know of the alteration?" Harcourt folded his hands. "He denies all knowledge. He is, I should say, a man of charitable reputation, gives generously to 2 or 3 parish foundations, is regarded well by his neighbours, and has been entirely cooperative with every inquiry thus far. He appears, on every surface, to be a model of civic virtue." Holmes turned to the window. The autumn light lay pale and oblique across the rooftops of Baker Street, and for a moment he was silent. I watched him, as I had learned to watch him, not for what he said, but for the almost imperceptible signs of engagement. The slight tightening at the corner of the mouth, the fingers which had ceased to lie slack and now pressed together at their tips. "You say the alteration was subtle," Holmes said at length. "Subtle enough to pass ordinary inspection." "It had passed for 8 months, Harcourt confirmed. "And the previous owner, Vane, you describe his reputation as clouded." "He was not, I think, a dishonest man in the common way, but he moved in circles where certain arrangements were conducted at the edge of legality. There were debts, obligations, and 1 or 2 matters that his solicitors, not ourselves, managed with some care to keep from public view. He died, as I understand it, without having set many of these affairs in order." Holmes rose abruptly from his chair and crossed to the mantelpiece, where he stood with his back to us for a moment, his fingers resting lightly upon the edge. When he turned, there was in his expression not excitement. Holmes was too disciplined for excitement, but rather the cool alertness of a chess player who has perceived, several moves ahead, that the board is more interesting than it appears. "What strikes me about your account, Mr. Harcourt," said he, "is not the alteration itself, which is not without precedent, but the quality of the calm which surrounds it. You describe a seller of questionable history, a buyer of impeccable reputation, a document of professional precision, and all parties speaking with uniform openness. That is a great deal of harmony for a matter involving fraud." Harcourt looked at him steadily. "You think it performed?" "I think," said Holmes, "that in cases of genuine innocence, one party is generally at least somewhat alarmed. When all parties are equally at ease, the ease itself becomes a datum." "I will look into this matter, Mr. Harcourt. I should like to visit the property and speak with those connected to it. In the meantime, I would be grateful if the original registry submission could be preserved exactly as it stands, and that no party involved be informed of my engagement." Harcourt rose and clasped his case. "I had already taken that precaution," said he. When he had gone, Holmes stood for a long moment at the window, looking down at the grey October street. I waited. "Well, Holmes," I said at last, "what do you make of it?" "I make very little of it yet, Watson," he said, without turning, "which is precisely what interests me. A man of doubtful history leaves a property encumbered by obligations he never settled. Another man of spotless character acquires that property, and the obligations are found to have been quietly erased from the official record. The alteration is discovered 8 months on by a junior clerk, and yet every principal party is calm, cooperative, and candid." He paused. "The unnatural calm surrounding this matter is not a sign of innocence, Watson. It is a sign of preparation." He turned from the window then, and I saw in his eyes that particular light, the cold, clear brightness of a mind that has found its quarry. "We shall go to Bloomsbury," said he, "and see for ourselves what virtue looks like when it has had time to rehearse." Chapter 2. The Circle of Interested Parties. We set out for Bloomsbury the following morning, Holmes having spent the intervening hours in a manner I had long since ceased to find alarming. Seated cross-legged upon the hearthrug in his dressing-gown, surrounded by directories, gazetteer entries, and the back numbers of 2 or 3 legal periodicals which I had not previously known him to possess. By the time I descended at 8:30, he was dressed, alert, and nursing his second cup of tea, with the suppressed energy of a man who has done the better part of his thinking, and is now simply waiting for the world to confirm it. The address in Montague Street proved to be a neat, narrow-fronted terrace house of the kind common to that part of Bloomsbury, 4 stories of sooty brick with freshly painted railings and a brass knocker kept to a high polish. It sat between its neighbours with an air of modest self-possession, and it required no particular observation to note that its present occupant had applied recent care to its upkeep. The window boxes, though past their season, had been recently tended. The steps were clean. Whatever shadows may have clung to the property under the late Mr. Vane, they had been conscientiously swept away. Mr. Silas Merridew received us in his front drawing-room with a promptness that suggested he had been expecting the visit, if not precisely us. He was a man of perhaps 60, broad through the shoulders, with a wide, rather handsome face that wore its amiability so thoroughly and consistently that it was, I found, slightly difficult to read. He had the manner of a man accustomed to being liked, unhurried, warm, self-possessed. He offered us chairs, declined to offer explanations until asked, and folded his large hands in his lap with the patience of someone who has nothing to conceal and is quite aware of the advantage that affords him. "I am grateful for your attention to this matter, Mr. Holmes," said he. "It has been a source of some anxiety, I confess, to find that the registry entry has been questioned. I purchased this house in good faith. Everything was conducted through Mr. Harcourt's office. I signed what was placed before me and paid what was asked." "You were acquainted with the previous owner?" Holmes asked. "With Cornelius Vane." "I knew him, yes, though I should not have described us as close. We had certain common connections, charitable foundations, a parish board or 2. One encounters such men in the course of civic life. He was not, I think, widely understood. He had a sharper mind than his reputation suggested, and a more complicated history than his acquaintances generally knew." Merridew met Holmes's gaze without flinching. I was aware of some difficulties, no more than the common gossip of these circles. Holmes nodded, asked 1 or 2 further questions of no apparent consequence, and then requested with easy courtesy to be introduced to the rest of the household. Merridew obliged without hesitation. The housekeeper, a Mrs. Elspeth Crail, met us in the hallway with the compact efficiency of a woman who has managed other people's domestic arrangements for so long that she has ceased to make any distinction between management and instinct. She was perhaps 55, of medium height, with iron grey hair drawn back without vanity, and dark eyes that assessed us both in the brief moment before she spoke. She had served Vane for 11 years, she told us, and had remained in the house upon Merridew's acquisition of it at his express invitation. There was nothing unusual in the arrangement, she said. She knew the house. It seemed sensible. I watched Holmes as she spoke. He asked her nothing of any importance, whether the chimneys drew well, whether the parish church nearby was high or low, whether she found the autumn damp troublesome. Mrs. Crail answered each question with brisk precision, and if she found the inquiries eccentric, she was too well trained to say so. Only at the last, as we turned to go, did Holmes pause. "You must miss certain aspects of the old arrangement," he remarked, with his customary air of saying something that is not quite what it appears to be. Mrs. Crail was still for the breadth of a heartbeat. "Every house has its own character," she said then evenly. "One adapts." The nephew, a Mr. Gerald Vane, arrived as we were being shown the upper rooms. He was the late Cornelius Vane's sister's son, a fact he volunteered without being asked, as though accustomed to establishing the precise degree of his connection at the outset. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean and dark, with the slightly distracted air of a man whose thoughts run ahead of his conversation. He had come, he said, to collect several remaining volumes from his uncle's personal library, which Merridew had generously agreed he might do at his convenience. He expressed no particular interest in the property, no resentment at its disposition, and greeted the news that Holmes and I were looking into the registry matter with a shrug of such complete indifference that I found myself noting it. "I have no claims upon this house," he said, with the simplicity of a man reciting an established fact. "My uncle's affairs were his own. I benefited from his generosity during his life, which was more than I had any right to expect." Holmes engaged him for some minutes on the subject of the library, which authors Vane had favoured, how extensively he had collected, whether he had been a man of systematic habits. Gerald Vane answered readily enough, and I noticed that he spoke of his uncle with more precision than warmth. There was knowledge there, and even a kind of respect, but none of the soft colouring of genuine affection. We called last by arrangement through Harcourt upon Mr. Thomas Reeve, the registry clerk who had processed the original submission. He received us in a small office near the registry building itself, a spare and orderly man of perhaps 40, with careful hands and the slight myopia of one whose work requires prolonged close attention. He had been the one to notice, he told us, that the ledger entry did not correspond precisely to the documents he himself had handled, and he was meticulous in his account of the discrepancy, the specific notations that had been altered, the dates of submission and sealing, the fact that he had brought the matter to his superiors at once. "You take particular pride in your work," Holmes observed. Reeve looked momentarily uncertain, as though unsure whether the remark was a compliment or a preliminary to something less comfortable. "I try to be thorough," he said. "Quite so," said Holmes, and moved at once to an entirely different subject. We walked back toward the Tottenham Court Road in silence for some minutes, Holmes with his hands in his pockets and his chin slightly lowered. The October air was cool and sharp with the smell of wet leaves and coal smoke, and the streets of Bloomsbury moved around us with their customary quiet industry. "Well," I said at last. "A civil set of people, I must say. I don't think I detected a single false note in any of them." Holmes glanced at me sidelong. "You detected 4, I looked at him. "Did I?" "You remarked upon Merridew's amiability being difficult to read. You noted Gerald Vane's indifference. You watched Mrs. Crail pause before answering my final question, and you observed Reeve's uncertainty when I complimented him. You perceived all of it, Watson. You simply did not yet know what to do with it." I considered this in silence for a moment. "And do you know what to do with it?" "Not yet," Holmes said. "But I know something more useful at this stage. I know that each of those 4 persons has been careful. Not nervous, not evasive. Careful. As though each has decided in advance precisely how much to offer and in precisely what tone." He paused at a corner, glancing up at the grey sky with a thoughtful expression. "That kind of uniformity does not arise from innocence, Watson. Innocence is various and untidy. What we encountered this morning had been, in some fashion, arranged." He said nothing further on the subject until we had hailed a cab, and even then relapsed into a silence I had learned not to interrupt. I watched London pass beyond the window and turned over the morning's impressions in my mind. The polished knocker, the careful housekeeper, the indifferent nephew, the precise clerk, and at the centre of it all, the broad, amiable figure of Silas Merridew, sitting with his hands folded and his expression perfectly, consistently, unfailingly at ease. Chapter 3. The Alteration Discovered. 2 days passed before Holmes received word from Harcourt that the registry office had completed its preliminary examination and was prepared to share its findings. During those 2 days, Holmes was, to outward appearance, entirely inactive. He played his violin at odd hours, read monographs on the chemistry of iron gall inks, and on one occasion spent the better part of an afternoon at the British Museum, returning without explanation and without apparent result. I had long since learned not to mistake these intervals of apparent idleness for anything of the kind. Holmes did not drift. When he appeared to be at rest, it generally meant that some internal mechanism had been set in motion and required only time to complete its revolution. We met Harcourt at the Land Registry office on a grey Thursday morning. He conducted us through a succession of corridors smelling of document varnish and old paper, to a small examination room where a young man was waiting with the solemnity of one who has made an uncomfortable discovery and is not yet certain how much trouble it will cause him. His name was Prentice, Edmund Prentice, a junior clerk of some 3 years' standing, slight and pale, with the look of a man who spends his working life in the careful service of precision and has recently been distressed to find that the world has not extended him the same courtesy. He had before him on the table a large bound ledger, open to a page marked with a slip of paper, and beside it the original submission documents as filed by Harcourt's office at the time of conveyance. "I noticed it quite by accident," Prentice said, with the apologetic air of a man who wishes he had not. "I was cross-referencing a separate matter in the same volume when the entry struck me as slightly irregular. The spacing between certain notations was not consistent with the surrounding entries. I examined it more closely and found that the notation regarding the encumbrance schedule had been altered." Holmes had already drawn the ledger toward him and was studying the entry with a small lens he had produced from his waistcoat pocket. He did not speak for some moments. Harcourt and I stood on either side of him, and young Prentice hovered at the foot of the table with his hands clasped. "The pen strokes in the altered section are marginally finer than those above and below," Holmes said at last, half to himself. "And here, at the terminal flourish of this letter, the ink has contracted very slightly differently from its neighbours, not enough to attract the eye without assistance, but the character is distinct." He straightened and addressed Prentice directly. "You said the alteration appeared to have been made after submission. What led you to that conclusion?" Prentice shifted. "The seals are undisturbed, sir. The wax impressions are intact. I assumed, therefore, that whoever had made the change had done so after the document had passed through formal processing, either by reopening the ledger while it was still accessible, or by some other means." "And who had access to this ledger between the date of submission and the date of final sealing?" "That is the difficulty," said Prentice. "During that interval, a period of approximately 9 days, the ledger lay in the general registry workroom. Several clerks handled it in the ordinary course. Mr. Reeve, who processed the submission, had it on his desk for the better part of 2 days. The volume was also, on one occasion, consulted by a visitor who had a legitimate inquiry regarding a neighbouring property." "A visitor?" Holmes repeated. "It is not uncommon," Harcourt put in. "Members of the public with legitimate interests in property records may consult certain volumes under supervision." "Under supervision," Holmes said. "Was supervision maintained on that occasion?" Prentice looked uncomfortable. The supervising clerk was called away briefly. It was thought to be a matter of minutes. The visitor had established his credentials, and the inquiry seemed routine. Holmes set down his lens and looked at the ceiling for a moment, with the patient expression of a man who has just had a fact of some importance confirmed. "And the visitor's name?" Prentice produced a small register from beside the ledger. Holmes read the entry, his expression unchanged, and passed it across to me without comment. The name entered was Aldous Fenwick, with an address in Kensington. I did not recognise it, and Holmes, when I glanced at him, offered nothing. He turned his attention back to the ledger entry, this time examining not the alteration itself but the surrounding text. The entries immediately preceding and following, the pagination, the marginal notations that ran in a neat column down the right side of the leaf. After several minutes he asked Prentice whether the ink used in the registry's own recording process was sourced from a single supplier and whether it had been consistent throughout the year in question. Prentice confirmed that it had. A standing contract with a particular firm in the city ensured uniformity. Then the ink in the altered section is visually indistinguishable from the surrounding entries, Holmes said. To the naked eye, in ordinary light, the alteration is undetectable. It required your cross-referencing to surface it at all. Whoever made this change had studied the ink, matched it with considerable care, and practiced the hand before committing the imitation to the ledger. That implies preparation, I said. It implies more than preparation, Holmes replied. It implies knowledge of the ink supply, knowledge of the specific hand used by the recording clerk, knowledge of the precise notations to be altered and their legal significance. This is not the work of an opportunist who found himself briefly alone with a ledger. The window of access was narrow and could not have been anticipated with certainty, which means the alteration was made quickly, but not without long prior study. Harcourt, who had been listening with the contained attention of a solicitor calculating consequences, spoke quietly. 3 persons had legitimate access during that 9-day interval. Reeve, as processing clerk, 2 other clerks in the workroom, and this visitor, Fenwick. Yes, said Holmes, and of those, only one had the combination of motive, foreknowledge, and the particular species of technical expertise that this alteration demands. He closed the ledger with a soft, definitive sound, though I am not yet prepared to say which one. He was quiet on the way back to Baker Street, his face turned to the window of the cab as the streets of the city gave way to the broader thoroughfares of the West End. I occupied myself with my own reflections on the morning, and found them various and not entirely satisfying. The alteration had been real, deliberate, and skillful. The motives now gathering at the edges of the case, concealed debt, inheritance, the erasure of obligation, each had a candidate. Yet none of the faces I had observed in Bloomsbury 2 days before wore the look of anyone capable of this species of cold, premeditated deception. "Holmes," I said, as we turned into Baker Street. "This name, Fenwick. You have not mentioned it before." "No," he said. "Is it significant?" He considered for a moment with a particular quality of pause that meant the answer was yes, but the time for it had not yet arrived. Everything is potentially significant until shown to be otherwise. That is the first principle. The second is that a name entered in a visitor's register is only evidence of one thing, that somebody wished that name to be found there. He glanced at me with a dry expression. Whether the person who wrote it had any connection with the person it belongs to is, as yet, an entirely open question. We mounted the stairs to our rooms, and Holmes went at once to his index, pulling out the relevant volume with the ease of long familiarity. I watched him run his finger down a column, stop, read, and then close the volume without expression. Whatever he had found, he placed it, as was his custom, in some internal ledger of his own, and said nothing further until Mrs. Hudson's welcome announcement of luncheon recalled us both to the more immediate obligations of the day. Chapter 4. Design beneath simplicity. Holmes did not speak of Fenwick again that day, nor the next. He was occupied, in the way I had come to associate with the middle distance of a case, with a series of small, apparently disconnected errands. A morning visit to Somerset House, an afternoon at the offices of a law stationer in Chancery Lane, and a correspondence conducted through 2 or 3 letters which he sealed himself and deposited at the post office on the corner, rather than entrusting to the usual arrangements. I asked no questions. Holmes would share his discoveries precisely when sharing them served the investigation, and not a moment before. On the Friday evening, however, he spread across the sitting-room table a set of notes which I recognised as the product of sustained analytical work. Dates, names, and intervals written in his small angular hand, connected by ruled lines, and, in 2 places, by question marks of emphatic size. He stood over these with his arms folded and regarded them with the expression of a surveyor who has taken all his measurements, and does not yet like the shape of the land. "Sit down, Watson," he said without looking up. "I want to think aloud, and you are useful for the purpose." I drew up my chair. Holmes remained standing. "The submission of the conveyance documents to the land registry took place on the 14th of February, he began. "The ledger was sealed on the 23rd, a span of 9 days, as Prentice told us. Within that window, 3 individuals had unambiguous access to the volume. Reeve, who processed the submission on the 14th and 15th, a clerk named Aldgate, who cross-referenced an adjacent entry on the 19th, and the visitor recorded as Aldous Fenwick, who consulted the volume on the 17th. 3 days into the window, I noted. Precisely. Now Reeve is meticulous almost to the point of rigidity. His own records confirm that he returned the ledger to the workroom shelf on the evening of the 15th and did not handle it again. Arthur Aldgate I have looked into and find nothing to suggest either the motive or the particular technical knowledge required, which brings us by the most direct road to Fenwick. And who is Fenwick? Holmes moved to the mantelpiece and took up his pipe, which he did not light. That is where simplicity begins to acquire a second layer. There is no Aldous Fenwick at the Kensington address entered in the register. The street exists, the number exists, but the name belongs to no current or recent resident. It is an invented identity, or rather, a borrowed one. Borrowed. Cornelius Vane had, in his earlier years, a solicitor's clerk of that name in his employ. Aldous Fenwick died in 1894. The name was taken from a man who could not dispute its use, chosen, I would suggest, by someone who knew Vane's history with sufficient intimacy to have access to such an obscure particular. I considered this. That narrows the field considerably. It does. The name points towards someone within Vane's former circle, close enough to know his old employees, familiar enough with his affairs to understand the precise legal significance of the encumbrance notation. It points, in short, towards someone who'd been studying this property and its history, not for weeks, but for years. He set down his pipe and returned to the table, tracing with one finger the chronology he had laid out. Now attend to the timing. The alteration had to have been made during the visitor's access on the 17th. The supervising clerk was absent for, by his own account, between 4 and 8 minutes. In that interval, the alteration was executed, the correct section located, the prepared ink applied, the imitated hand reproduced, and the volume returned to its proper position. 4 to 8 minutes, I said. That is a very small margin. It is, and yet the alteration is flawless. Which tells us one of two things. Either our man is a forger of extraordinary facility, capable of performing under severe time constraint work that might otherwise take an hour, or the alteration was not in its entirety made during those 4 to 8 minutes. He looked at me steadily. The ink was prepared in advance. The section of text to be modified had been committed to memory. The pen strokes were rehearsed until they could be reproduced in seconds. What took place on the 17th was not the act of creation. It was the act of execution, the final, a rapid application of a plan conceived and rehearsed across a much longer period. Which suggests, I said slowly, that the decision to alter the record was made before the conveyance was even finalised. Holmes's expression shifted in a way I recognised, the slight deepening of attention that accompanied a point well made. Before the documents were submitted, he said, perhaps before the purchase was concluded. The plan did not arise in response to the documents. The purchase itself may have been conducted with the alteration already in mind. The fire had burned low, and the room had grown cool around us without either of us having noticed. Yvonne, I looked at the notes spread across the table, the dates and names and intervals, and felt the particular chill that comes not from the temperature of the air, but from the sudden perception of a deliberate intelligence operating at some remove behind the ordinary surface of events. Then Merridew, I said. Possibly Merridew, Holmes corrected, or someone acting in concert with Merridew, or someone acting entirely independently of him, toward an end that happens to coincide with his interests. We are not yet in a position to be precise. He gathered his notes with a measured care that contrasted usefully with the sharpness of his reasoning. What we can say is this. 3 individuals had access, 2 can be substantially accounted for, and the third used a false identity drawn from the intimate history of the deceased owner. The alteration was not impulsive. The preparation was extensive. The knowledge required was specific. And yet, he paused. And yet, I prompted, and yet not one of the persons we visited in Bloomsbury exhibited the anxiety of guilt. I have observed men and women in the aftermath of deliberate crime for 30 years, Watson. The planning may be cold, but the aftermath rarely is. There is generally some residue, a watchfulness, a slight overcorrectness, a fraction too much ease. What I encountered in Montague Street was not the simulation of innocence. It was something more interesting. He moved to his armchair and settled into it with a reflective air. It was the composure of persons who believe themselves, on some fundamental level, to have done nothing wrong. I turned this over in my mind for some time after Holmes had relapsed into silence. The fire settled in the grate. Outside, a late cab moved along Baker Street with the unhurried sound of a city preparing for sleep. "That is a curious kind of criminal psychology," I said at last. "It is the most dangerous kind," Holmes replied, without opening his eyes. "A man who knows himself to be a villain can be made to feel the weight of what he has done. A man who has persuaded himself that his deception was justified is armoured against remorse in a way that simple villainy never is." He was quiet for a moment. "We shall need to find the seam in that armour, Watson. Every such conviction, however sincerely held, has one." He said nothing more. I sat with the dying fire and the spread of notes on the table, and thought about patience. The patience of a plan years in the making, and the patience of the one man I knew who might prove equal to unravelling it. Chapter 5. The Weight of Obligation. Holmes sent word to Mrs. Crail on the Saturday morning, requesting a second interview at her convenience, and framing the request in terms so carefully ordinary that she would have found it difficult to decline without drawing attention to the act of declining. Her reply came by early afternoon. She would receive us at 4 o'clock. Merridew, she noted, would be engaged at his parish board until 6. I observed the timing of that detail with some interest. Holmes, reading the note, observed it with none, or rather, with the particular quality of stillness that meant he had observed it very thoroughly indeed. And we arrived at Montague Street as the last of the afternoon light was dissolving into the leaden early dusk of a London October. Mrs. Crail admitted us herself, led us not to the drawing-room where we had spoken before, but to a smaller sitting-room at the rear of the house, a room that bore, in its arrangement of furniture and the disposition of certain objects on the mantelpiece, the unmistakable character of long personal occupation. A woman's room, I thought, in the sense that it had been shaped by habit rather than by instruction. She poured tea without being asked, and sat opposite us with her hands resting in her lap, and her dark eyes moving between Holmes and me with an alertness that she made no effort to disguise. Whatever Mrs. Crail was, she was not a woman who found it necessary to perform composure. Her composure was of the settled, structural variety, built into the architecture of the woman rather than applied to the surface of her. Holmes began, as was his occasional custom in interviews of this nature, at an angle entirely removed from the subject at hand. He asked about the room, whether the watercolour above the mantelpiece was her own, whether the fern by the window required much attention in the winter months, whether she had come to vain service from London or from elsewhere. From Shropshire, she said, 30 years ago. She had been in service since her middle 20s and had held 4 positions in that time, of which Vane's household had been the longest, and she said, with the measured frankness of someone who has decided in advance how candid to be, the most complicated. "In what respect complicated?" Holmes asked, with an ease that made the question sound like mere curiosity. Mrs. Crail was quiet for a moment. She looked at her tea rather than at Holmes. "Mr. Vane was not a simple man to work for," she said at last. "He was generous in some respects and very exacting in others. He had a talent for placing people under obligation and was not always scrupulous about how he made use of that talent." "Including members of his household?" "Including everyone he dealt with." She lifted her eyes. "I do not say he was unkind. He was not. But kindness and obligation are not the same thing, and he sometimes confused them, or chose to." Holmes set down his cup. "You remained with him for 11 years. "I did." "Despite the complications?" "The work was known to me," she said simply, "and there were considerations." She did not elaborate, and Holmes did not press her immediately. He moved instead, with the patience of a man following a faint scent, to the subject of Vane's latter years. His health, his habits, the narrowing of his social circle as he aged, and certain of his associations became harder to maintain with discretion. Mrs. Crail spoke of these things with a careful evenness that I found, as a medical man, more revealing than agitation would have been. She had organised her memories of Vane into a form she was prepared to offer, selective, accurate so far as it went, but shaped by some governing principle she had not yet disclosed. He was not well in his final year, she said. He knew it, and it made him anxious about certain matters that he had previously managed to avoid thinking about. He spoke, more than once, of wanting to put things right. Specific things? Holmes asked. A pause, shorter than the previous one. There were people he felt he had treated badly, one family in particular. He spoke of them with, I would say with shame, though he was not a man who wore shame openly. He had acquired something from them in years past, through means that were not, I think, entirely honourable. He wished to see it returned. The Bloomsbury property, Holmes said. It was not a question. Mrs. Crail looked at him steadily for a moment, and I saw in that look not surprise, but the adjusted expression of a person who had expected to be understood eventually, and had simply been waiting to discover when. He never told me the details, she said. I knew there was a property involved. I knew it had come to him through a transaction that he described, or once, as having been conducted more to his advantage than to the other parties. I knew the other party had not prospered afterwards. Did he take any steps before his death to make the restoration he intended? He consulted his solicitors twice in his final months. I do not know what was discussed. He died before anything was formalised. She set down her own cup with a quiet final sound. Whatever he intended to do, he did not do it. Holmes was silent for a moment. Outside, a cart moved slowly along the street, and the sound of it came muffled through the heavy curtains. Then he asked, in the same unhurried tone he had used throughout, "Mrs. Crail, how long have you known Mr. Merridew?" The stillness that followed was of a different quality from the pauses that had preceded it. Not longer, particularly, but denser. "We were acquainted through Mr. Vane," she said, "over a number of years." He was aware then of Vane's intentions regarding the property. "I cannot speak to what Mr. Merridew knew, or did not know." "No," Holmes agreed pleasantly, "but you can speak, I think, to what you told him." Mrs. Crail looked at Holmes for a long, composed moment. Then something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, precisely, and not defiance. It was closer to the look of a person who's been carrying a weight for some time, and has finally been offered, by a reliable party, the option of setting it down. "I told him what I have told you," she said quietly, "that Mr. Vane wished to see the property return to its rightful line, that he had not lived to accomplish it." A pause. "I considered it information that someone ought to have." Holmes thanked her, and we took our leave shortly afterward. On the steps, in the cold early dark of the street, I turned to him, my breath visible in the evening air. "She handed it to him," I said. "The motive, the justification." "She handed him the idea that justice had been thwarted," Holmes replied, turning up his collar, "and left him to form his own conclusions about whether someone ought to complete it. She may not have intended the specific consequences, but she provided the moral foundation upon which those consequences were built." He paused at the gate. "Which makes her, Watson, not an innocent, but not precisely a criminal either. She occupies that careful middle ground which the law has always found most troublesome." We walked in silence to the main road, and I thought about Vane, his belated shame, his unfinished intentions, and the strange second-hand generosity of a dead man's conscience, set in motion by a housekeeper's quiet words, achieving through deception what it had never achieved through honesty. It was, I reflected, a very human kind of irony. Chapter 6. Fear without accusation. There are moments in an investigation when the accumulation of evidence reaches a point at which Holmes becomes, paradoxically, less communicative rather than more. The closer he draws to the centre of a matter, the more completely he retires into himself. Not from any desire for concealment, but because the final, decisive phase of his reasoning demands a quality of concentration that casual conversation would disturb. I had learned to read this withdrawal not as obscurity but as progress. and to occupy myself usefully in its shadow without demanding admission to the process. The Sunday passed in near total silence at Baker Street. On the Monday, Holmes sent 3 brief notes by messenger and received, over the course of the afternoon, 3 replies. He read each one, placed it in the morocco case he kept for active matters, and said nothing. On the Tuesday morning, however, he appeared at the breakfast table with the alert, somewhat compressed energy of a man who has finished his preparations and is about to begin the final movement. "I intend to call upon Reeve this morning," he said, pouring his coffee, "and upon Merridew this afternoon. I should be glad of your company at both." "You have formed a plan," I said. "I have formed 2 or 3 tests," he replied. "The distinction is important. A plan presupposes a known conclusion and works toward it. A test is designed to produce information regardless of which direction the answer falls." He glanced across the table with a dry expression. "Though I confess I have a strong prior expectation as to which direction these particular answers will fall." We found Thomas Reeve in his office at 10:30, apparently engaged in the ordinary work of his morning. He received us without visible discomfort and offered us seats with the practised courtesy of a man accustomed to receiving inquiries from members of the public. Holmes settled into his chair with the relaxed air of a man paying a social call, and began by expressing, in terms of easy good humour, his admiration for the exactitude with which the Registry conducted its affairs. Reeve received this graciously, yet they spoke for a few minutes on the general subject of document preservation, Holmes showing, as he could when it served him, a well-informed interest in technical processes quite sufficient to convince the other party of his expertise. Then, with no change of tone, Holmes mentioned, as though it had only just occurred to him, that he had been reading with interest some recent correspondence in a legal journal regarding improved methods of document verification, photographic techniques, he believed, that allowed examination of ink composition with a degree of precision previously unavailable. He did not look at Reeve as he said this. He was examining with apparent idle interest a framed certificate on the wall. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds. I would not have characterized it, to an observer without prior context, as anything remarkable. But I had spent enough years watching Holmes conduct these quiet experiments to recognize the quality of the pause, the slight arrest of natural breathing, the fractional delay before the resumption of composure, for what it was. "I had not seen that correspondence," Reeve said then, smoothly enough. "The field moves quickly." "Remarkably quickly," Holmes agreed, and moved at once to another subject entirely. We left Reeve 20 minutes later and made our way westward through the luncheon crowds of the city. Holmes did not comment on the interview, and I asked nothing. The afternoon took us back to Montague Street, where Merridew received us in the same drawing room as before, with the same broad, settled amiability, and the same large hands folded with their characteristic patience. Holmes made no mention of registry procedure or documentary verification. He spoke instead for some time about handwriting, specifically about the Victorian fashion for copperplate instruction in schools, the decline of that tradition, and the difficulty of maintaining a consistent personal hand in an age when so much correspondence was conducted through clerks and typewriting machines. It was the kind of conversation that could have occurred between any 2 educated men of the period, discursive and apparently purposeless, and Merridew engaged with it easily, demonstrating a gentlemanly familiarity with the subject. Then Holmes remarked, as though following a natural association of ideas, that he had been consulting recently with a graphologist of some repute, a Dr. Bernhard of University College, he said, whose analyses of imitated hands had been of material assistance to the legal authorities on 2 or 3 occasions. The man had, Holmes added with an air of mild enthusiasm, an almost uncanny facility for identifying the original writer behind a practised imitation, even when the forgery itself was technically excellent. Merridew turned his teacup a quarter rotation in its saucer. It was, in its way, an even smaller movement than Reeve's pause had been. A man shifting a cup as he listened was nothing, and yet the hand that performed the movement, that large, steady, a characteristically patient hand, performed it with a fraction of the deliberateness of a man who has just heard something he did not expect to hear and is deciding in the space of half a second how to receive it. Graphology is a fascinating discipline, Merridew said with perfect pleasantness, though I understand its evidential standing in court remains somewhat contested. Contested, yes, Holmes agreed cheerfully, though becoming less so, I am told, with each passing year. We stayed another quarter of an hour and departed on terms of mutual civility. Holmes said nothing until we had turned the corner into the main thoroughfare. Then he stopped, very briefly, to light his pipe in the shelter of a doorway, and when he emerged his expression had the settled, almost satisfied quality of a man who has verified the last of his calculations. "Well," I said. "Both of them," he said. "Reeve and Merridew both reacted. Reeve to the mention of photographic ink analysis, Merridew to the mention of a graphologist who specialises in identifying writers behind imitated hands." He drew on his pipe and let the smoke carry away on the November air. Reeve's reaction was the larger, which is interesting. A man with clear conscience might hear of an improved verification technique and think nothing of it. Reeve thought something of it. And Merridew? Merridew's reaction was smaller but more precisely targeted. The graphologist speaks directly to the act of imitation, the forged hand. Reeve could potentially be connected to the matter in several ways. Merridew is connected to it in one way only. He looked along the street with a reflective expression. I did not accuse either of them. I mentioned no suspicion, raised no direct challenge, made no reference to the specific case. What I observed were unguarded responses to the perception of threat. Threat felt before the rational mind could frame a denial. "You're quite certain, then?" "I have been quite certain since Mrs. Crail's sitting room," Holmes said. What I required was confirmation that both men had reason to be afraid, and the specific nature of what each feared. He began to walk again, his step unhurried. Fear is not of itself proof of guilt, but it is the most reliable guide we possess to where proof resides. Reeve fears the ink analysis because it speaks to something he knows about the physical document. Merridew fears the graphologist because it speaks to something he knows about who made the alteration. He fell silent. Around us the afternoon street moved with its ordinary purpose, and I turned over what he had said with the feeling, familiar from many such afternoons, of standing at the edge of a clearing that was about to become fully visible. "They know different things," I said slowly. "They're afraid of different discoveries." Holmes glanced at me with an expression that in another man I might have called approving. "Now you begin to see it," he said. "Fear reveals itself most clearly when it believes itself unseen, and when two men fear two different revelations arising from the same document, the question one must ask is not which of them is guilty, but whether the document itself is telling us something that neither of them has yet understood it to say." He left that thought, as was his habit, without elaboration, and we walked the rest of the way to the cab rank in a silence that, on my part at least, was a good deal less comfortable than his. Chapter 7. The Convenient Resolution. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Baker Street on the Wednesday morning with the brisk, self-possessed air of a man bearing good news and fully conscious of the effect it will produce. He was shown up by Mrs. Hudson, declined tea with the energy of someone who has already had 3 cups, and settled himself into the basket chair with his hat upon his knee and his expression arranged in the manner I had observed many times over the years, the look of a Scotland Yard man who has solved a problem and is about to say so in terms that generously acknowledge the contributions of others. Holmes received him with the patient courtesy he reserved for Lestrade, a blend of genuine respect for the inspector's tenacity and a carefully suppressed amusement at certain habitual tendencies of his method. He sat opposite and folded his long fingers together and listened. "I think we have our man in the registry business," Lestrade said, with commendable directness. "Edmund Prentice, the junior clerk." I looked at Holmes. He had not moved. "On what grounds?" Holmes asked. Lestrade opened a small notebook. Opportunity first. He was present in the workroom throughout the relevant 9-day window, more consistently, in fact, than Reeve himself. He had access to the ledger at any number of points that were not formally recorded, because junior clerks are not required to log each handling of a volume in current use. Second, the ink. Prentice was responsible, during that period, for replenishing the workroom's ink supply. He ordered it, received it, distributed it. He would have known, better than anyone, exactly what formulation was in use. That is a circumstantial point, Holmes observed, without inflection. Circumstantial, yes, but suggestive. Third, and this I consider the strongest element, we have found an inconsistency in his account of when he discovered the alteration. He told you, and told his superiors, that he noticed the irregularity while cross-referencing a separate matter. But we have established that the separate matter he cited was not assigned to him until 4 days after he first raised the alarm internally. He knew about the alteration before he had any professional reason to be in that section of the ledger. Holmes was silent for a moment. Outside, a November wind pressed against the window glass with a thin, persistent sound. And motive, Holmes said. Lestrade permitted himself a small, satisfied movement of the shoulders. Prentice had applied 6 months before the alteration for a senior position within the Registry. The application was declined. Merridew, as it happens, is a subscriber to 2 charitable foundations that have close connections with the Registry's administrative board. A man eager for advancement, passed over once, with access and knowledge and a connection to a patron whose interests would be served. It is not a difficult thread to follow. No, Holmes agreed, it is not. I watched him. There was in his manner something I recognised with a slight unease. The quality of listening that was not the listening of a man receiving new information, but of a man confirming the particular shape of a hypothesis he had formed some time ago. He was not surprised by Lestrade's account. He was, I thought, measuring it. Lestrade proceeded to outline the evidentiary picture with the orderly satisfaction of a craftsman displaying finished work. The testimony of 2 other clerks, he said, placed Prentice near the relevant shelf on the afternoon of the 17th, the same afternoon the visitor recorded as Fenwick had consulted the volume. The false name in the visitor's register might even have been supplied by Prentice himself, to provide a convenient alternative suspect should the matter be examined. Minor inconsistencies in Prentice's initial testimony, when set against the statements of his colleagues, suggested a man who had been careful but not careful enough. All parties, I am pleased to say, are expressing satisfaction with the conclusion, Lestrade added. Merridew, Harcourt, even young Prentice's supervisor, who is, I think, somewhat relieved to have the business settled without further disruption to the office. It has the virtue, Mr. Holmes, of tidiness. It has the virtue of tidiness, Holmes repeated very gently. Yes. Lestrade glanced at him with the sharpened attention of a man who has learned over many years that when Holmes repeats a phrase in that particular tone, it generally precedes a complication. You have reservations. I have observations, Holmes said. I will not share them today, Lestrade, because they are not yet complete, but I should like to ask you, as a courtesy between professionals, to take no formal action against Prentice for a further 48 hours. Lestrade frowned. The evidence is sufficient for— The evidence is consistent with guilt, Holmes interrupted, with a firmness that did not require volume to carry its weight. Consistency and sufficiency are not the same standard, as you know rather better than most. 48 hours, Lestrade. If I find nothing to alter the picture in that interval, you will have my full endorsement and my sincere apologies for the delay. There was a pause. Lestrade regarded Holmes with the expression of a man performing a rapid internal calculation involving professional pride, habitual caution, and the accumulated evidence of long experience, that when Holmes asked for 48 hours there was generally a reason worth the asking. 48 hours, he said, replacing his notebook. I shall hold the matter at its present stage. But I want your word, Holmes, that if there is something in the weeds here, you will bring it to me and not manage it independently. You have it, Holmes said, and the inspector departed with the slightly deflated manner of a man whose news has been received with qualified rather than unqualified enthusiasm. When the door had closed, I turned to Holmes. He was already on his feet and moving to the window, reeled, where he stood looking down at the street with his hands clasped behind him. "You do not believe it," I said. "I believe every particular of Lestrade's account," Holmes replied. "Prentice was near the shelf. Prentice knew the ink supply. Prentice has an inconsistency in his testimony. All of that is true." He paused. "It is also taken in sum considerably too convenient." "Too convenient how?" He turned from the window. "Consider what Lestrade has assembled. Opportunity, proximity, knowledge, motive, and a suggestive inconsistency in testimony. It is a persuasive case. More persuasive, in fact, than most of the cases that actually proceed to conviction, because in most such cases, at least one element is uncertain or requires interpretation. Here, every element coheres. Everything points the same direction." He picked up his pipe from the mantelpiece and examined the bowl without lighting it. "In my experience, Watson, the evidence in a case of genuine guilt is rarely so obligingly unanimous. Real guilt leaves asymmetries, details that point the wrong way, facts that require explanation rather than fitting neatly into the established account. When I find a picture that is entirely without such asymmetries, I do not congratulate myself on a simple case. I ask who composed the picture. I absorb this for a moment. You think Prentice has been positioned. I think Prentice has been positioned with considerable skill, by someone who understood that a convenient secondary suspect is as effective a protection as destroying evidence, and considerably more durable." He replaced the pipe. "The question is not whether Prentice looks guilty. He looks extremely guilty. The question is whether his guilt is the kind that arises from the commission of an act, or the kind that arises from having been placed, with expert care, in precisely the right position for it to appear so." He said nothing more on the subject that afternoon, but I noticed as the November light faded over Baker Street and the lamps below came on one by one, that he returned twice to the Morocco case containing the documents of the case, and that on both occasions he sat for some time afterward in unbroken silence, with the expression of a man who is waiting for a single stubborn piece to declare its proper place. The 48 hours, I gathered, would be well used. Chapter 8. The ink that does not agree. Holmes was gone before I came down on the Thursday morning. Mrs. Hudson, clearing the breakfast things with the philosophical equanimity of a woman long accustomed to irregular hours, informed me that he had left shortly after 6 with his coat and the small leather instrument case he took on occasions requiring close analytical work. She had no idea where he had gone, and her tone suggested that she had ceased some years ago to find this circumstance worthy of either remark or concern. I occupied the morning with correspondence and a short consultation at my practice, and returned to Baker Street at noon to find the sitting-room empty and the remains of Holmes's early departure, a scatter of reference volumes, an ashtray used and not cleared, the Morocco case open on the desk with several documents arranged in a semicircle around it, exactly as they had been. I read and waited. He came in at 2:30 with the November damp on his shoulders, and the contained economic energy of a man who has accomplished several things in a short time, and is now ready to accomplish several more. He did not sit down. He went directly to the desk, selected 2 of the documents from the semicircle, and held them side by side at an angle to the window's grey afternoon light for nearly a minute, his face bent close and his expression wholly absorbed. Then he set them down and turned to me. "I have been to the Registry," he said, "with a letter from Harcourt authorising examination of the ledger under my own instruments. I spent 3 hours on the altered entry under magnification, and 2 different lighting conditions, standard and raking. The raking light was the critical one." "What did you find?" He crossed to the armchair but did not sit. He stood behind it with his hands resting on its back, an attitude I associated with the presentation of a conclusion he had been carrying some time, and was now prepared to release. "The ink in the altered section is visually identical to the surrounding entries under ordinary conditions. I confirmed that much again this morning. The match is excellent. Colour, viscosity, the degree of surface penetration into the paper, whoever prepared it had taken considerable pains. He paused. Under raking light. However, light directed at a low angle across the surface of the page. The altered section shows a marginally different reflective quality from the entries immediately surrounding it. The ink has a fractionally higher surface sheen. Meaning it is newer, I said. That would be the natural inference. An ink applied after the surrounding text would have had less time to fully oxidize and settle into the paper fibres, and would therefore retain a slightly higher surface luster. That was Prentice's conclusion, and Lestrade's, and, I confess, my own initial inclination. He moved around the chair and sat now, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. But I asked myself a question this morning that I had not previously asked with sufficient rigour. The difference in reflectivity is not large. It is perceptible under raking light to a trained eye, but it is subtle. Why should an alteration made after the document was sealed, clandestinely, under time pressure, produce a difference so subtle that it required specialist examination to detect? If Prentice or Fenwick applied fresh ink over 8-month-old surroundings, the disparity should, if anything, be more pronounced. The freshness of the alteration would have been its greatest vulnerability. I followed this with some care. You're saying it is not pronounced enough. I am saying that the degree of difference is more consistent with an ink applied at a shorter remove from the surrounding text than with one applied 8 months later. The surrounding entries in that section of the ledger were made in late January and early February. The conveyance submission was dated the 14th of February. He held my gaze steadily. The reflective disparity I observed this morning is consistent with an ink applied perhaps days, not months, before the document was sealed. It suggests the alteration was made before the sealing, not after. The implication arranged itself in my mind with the slow, irrevocable quality of a door settling into its frame. Before the document was officially processed, I said. Before it ever reached the registry workroom. Before it left Harcourt's office, Holmes said quietly. I sat with this for a moment. The fire ticked in the grate. Outside, a November drizzle had begun against the window, and the street below was the colour of pewter. Then Prentice never touched it, I said. He could not have. The document was already altered when it was submitted. His proximity, his knowledge of the ink supply, his inconsistency of testimony, all of it is irrelevant. He was never in a position to have made the change. His inconsistency of testimony has a straightforward explanation that Lestrade did not pause to examine, Holmes said. A junior clerk who notices an irregularity in a document handled by his seniors is in a delicate professional position. It is entirely credible that he conducted a small preliminary investigation of his own, confirmed the alteration to his own satisfaction, before reporting it formally. His account of when he discovered the matter may be imprecise, not because he is concealing guilt, but because he is concealing the fact that he did not immediately do what procedure required. He settled back slightly. Men conceal awkward innocence with much the same air as men conceal guilt. Lestrade, who was looking for one, found evidence of the other, and the visitor, Fenwick, whose access provided the supposed window of opportunity, also a construction, Holmes said. The name in the register was placed there to ensure that any investigation of access during the 9 days would produce an alternative focal point. A mysterious visitor, a false identity drawn from Vane's obscure history, sufficient to occupy an investigation and, if necessary, to direct suspicion toward those most recently connected with the documents. He met my eyes. It was placed there before the document was submitted. It was not a spontaneous precaution. It was part of the original plan. I rose and went to the window, not from any particular purpose, but because I needed the small physical movement that thought sometimes requires. The rain was fine and steady on the glass. The alteration was made before submission, I said slowly. Not in the registry, not by a clerk with access to a workroom shelf, not during a 4-minute window of unsupervised access. It was made at the document's point of origin, by someone who handled it before it ever reached official hands. I turned. Which means it was made by someone with access to the conveyance documents in their preparatory stage. Holmes was watching me with the focused patience of a teacher waiting for a pupil to complete a proof unaided. Harcourt prepared the documents, I said. Harcourt's office prepared the documents, Holmes said, which is a distinction with a meaningful difference. He rose and went to the desk, selecting a single sheet from among those arranged there. I visited Somerset House on Monday and located the record of Merridew's earlier property transactions, 3 of them, over the past 12 years. In each case, the conveyancing solicitor was not Harcourt and Vane, but a separate firm. Meridew instructed Harcourt specifically and exclusively for this transaction. He set the paper down. A solicitor one selects for a specific purpose rather than from established habit, is a solicitor one has selected for a reason. I intend to discover what that reason was. He reached for his coat. The afternoon was advancing and the rain, if anything, thickening. There is one further matter, he said, drawing it on. The ledger entry that was altered removed all reference to the encumbrance schedule. I have obtained, through Harcourt's office, the original encumbrance documents. They refer to obligations incurred by Cornelius Vane in the year 1881, secured against the Bloomsbury property, and owed to a party described only by initial and address. He paused at the door. The address is in Montague Street, not the property. A different number entirely, an older address. For a family that occupied that street many years before Vane ever came to hold any interest in it. He looked at me with an expression that carried, beneath its habitual composure, something I could only describe as the satisfaction of a man who has found, at last, the true beginning of a story he's been reading from the middle. The encumbrance was not a financial debt, Watson, he said. It was a recorded acknowledgement of a moral one, and Meridew did not erase it because it was inconvenient. He erased it because he knew exactly what it meant, and to whom. Chapter 9. Truth in Quiet Calculation. Holmes spent the Thursday evening at his desk, and I heard him there still when I retired at 11, the occasional scratch of his pen, the soft turn of a page, once the quiet, deliberate sound of a drawer opened and closed. By the Friday morning he'd arranged everything. I knew this not from anything he said, but from the particular quality of stillness that had replaced the concentrated activity of the preceding days, the stillness of a mechanism that has completed its winding and stands ready. He sent notes to Harcourt, to Meridew, to Mrs. Crail, and to Gerald Vane, requesting their presence at the Montague Street house at 3 o'clock on Friday afternoon. A separate note went to Lestrade, briefer than the others, informing him that the matter of Edmund Prentice required his immediate personal attention, and that the address and hour were as above. Holmes didn't explain. He rarely did in these summonses. The explanations were reserved for the appointed hour itself, delivered with a completeness that rendered prior notice unnecessary and, in his view, are likely to compromise the careful structure of the occasion. We arrived in Montague Street at 2:45. Mrs. Crail admitted us without the formal ceremony of a household receiving guests. She had clearly understood from the tone of Holmes's note that this was not a social call, and showed us to the drawing-room, where a fire had been made up and chairs arranged with an unconscious symmetry that suggested she had given the matter of seating some thought. Holmes surveyed the room briefly, moved 2 of the chairs by small degrees, and then stood at the mantelpiece with his back to the fire, in the attitude of a man who has chosen his ground. The others arrived within 20 minutes of one another. Harcourt came first, Eustace with his leather case and his expression of a professional man navigating uncertain territory with trained composure. Gerald Vane arrived next, his coat still carrying the outdoor chill, his habitual air of distraction somewhat modified by what I read as wary attention. Meridew came last, and came with the unhurried confidence of a man who has received such a summons before, and does not intend to allow it to disturb his equilibrium. He greeted Holmes with the same warm, settled civility as always, took the chair that had been left for him without appearing to notice which it was, and folded his hands. Lestrade entered quietly 2 minutes after Meridew, and stationed himself near the door with the professional discretion of a man who has been asked to listen before he acts. Holmes waited until the small sounds of arrival had settled. Then he spoke, and his voice had that quality, unhurried, precise, carrying no more weight than the facts themselves required. That I had heard on perhaps 30 such occasions, and had never quite ceased to find arresting. "I am going to ask your patience for a short while," he said, "and I will ask each of you to reserve your questions until I have finished. What I have to say is somewhat involved, and its parts do not fully illuminate one another until the whole is presented." He began not with the alteration itself, but with Cornelius Vane, with the man as he had been in the years before respectability had softened the edges of his history. In the early 1880s, Holmes said, Vane had conducted himself in the manner of a man determined to advance his interests at a speed that legitimate means alone could not support. There had been a family, a name he had now confirmed through parish records and 2 surviving legal instruments, by the name of Carow, resident for 2 generations in Montague Street, at a number some doors from the present property. The head of that family, one Robert Carow, had entered into a commercial arrangement with Vane in 1881, the precise nature of which Holmes declined to detail in full, but the effect of which had been the transfer of the Bloomsbury freehold to Vane under conditions that a court of equity, had it been invited to examine them, might well have characterised as unconscionable. I watched the room as Holmes spoke. Harcourt was attentive and still. Gerald Vane's eyes had dropped to the carpet with the expression of a man hearing confirmed what he had long suspected. Mrs. Crail sat with her hands in her lap and her gaze fixed on Holmes with the focused, undefended attention of someone who has waited for this particular moment for a considerable time. And Merridew sat with his hands folded and his expression composed, watching Holmes with the careful steadiness of a man who has decided that the most dignified course is to hear everything before he speaks. The encumbrance recorded against the property, Holmes continued, was not a financial obligation in the conventional sense. It was a notation inserted at Vane's own direction, acknowledging the nature of the transaction and recording a moral debt to the Carow family. Whether this was an act of conscience or a legal precaution designed to forestall future challenge, I cannot say with certainty. It remained in the registry record, unexercised and quietly accumulating the dust of decades until the property came to be sold. He turned slightly toward Merridew. "You are a Carow on your mother's side." The room received this without sound. Merridew met Holmes's gaze and said nothing. "Your mother was the younger daughter of Robert Carow, who died in reduced circumstances in 1889, having never recovered the financial footing he lost through his arrangement with Vane. You grew up knowing the broad outline of the story, though not, I think, the precise legal record. It was Mrs. Crail who told you of Vane's late-life intention to make restitution, and it was your own subsequent research, assisted by someone with access to the preparatory documents, that revealed the encumbrance notation and its specific significance." "The encumbrance notation named the Carow family explicitly?" Harcourt asked, his voice controlled but not quite even. "By initial and address," Holmes said. "R. Carow, Montague Street. Sufficient to anyone who knew what to look for." He returned his attention to Merridew. "You did not purchase this property for personal gain. You purchased it because it had belonged to your family, had been taken from them by means you considered dishonest, and had been held for 40 years without the restoration that its own encumbered record acknowledged was owed. You erased the encumbrance not to conceal a debt, but because the debt, in your understanding, had been settled by the act of restoration itself. The notation was, to your mind, a record of an obligation that no longer existed." Merridew spoke for the first time since Holmes had begun. His voice was very steady. "That is a precise account," he said. "It is a precise crime," Holmes replied without harshness. "However clearly you understood the moral architecture of what you did, the method was fraud. The alteration of a legal document is not validated by the justice of the motive behind it, however sincerely that justice was felt." He paused. "The alteration was made in Harcourt's office before the documents were submitted, by someone with access to the conveyance papers in their preparatory stage. You selected Harcourt's firm specifically for this transaction, having established in advance that a particular member of their office, not Harcourt himself, I think, would assist you. The silence that followed was a different species from all the silences that had preceded it in that room over the preceding weeks. It was the silence of resolution, of a thing long suspended finally arriving at its natural resting place. Merridew looked at his hands for a moment. Then he looked up, and his expression, which had carried its composed amiability through every stage of the proceedings, had changed at last into something that was simply honest. "I believed," he said quietly, "that what I was doing was right. I still believe it. The property was my family's. It was taken dishonestly. Vane himself knew it and recorded as much." "Yes," Holmes said, "and that record and the moral weight it carries will be among the factors the law must now consider." He glanced toward Lestrade briefly. "Prentice is innocent of any involvement. The false entry in the visitor's register was placed there before submission and was designed to provide a misleading focal point. I should be glad if that gentleman's position were clarified without delay." Lestrade, who had been still as furniture throughout, gave a single nod. Holmes stepped back from the mantelpiece then, and the formality of the occasion seemed to settle from him like a coat. The fire crackled behind him, and the November afternoon pressed grey and quiet against the windows of the house in Montague Street, the house that had been a family's, and then a transaction, and then a secret, and was now, at last, simply a fact laid bare in the indifferent light. "The rest," Holmes said to no one in particular, "just belongs to others to determine." Chapter 10. The Measure of Justice. The aftermath of such affairs rarely possesses the clean resolution that the preceding investigation seems to promise. I have observed this many times in my years with Holmes, and the matter of the altered land registry entry proved no exception. The truth once delivered did not simplify the situation so much as it transferred its complexity from the realm of the unknown into the considerably more difficult realm of the known. Lestrade remained at Montague Street after Holmes and I had taken our leave, as did Harcourt, whose professional obligations to Merridew had entered, by that afternoon's events, into a delicate and ambiguous new phase. I did not envy him the conversation that lay ahead. Gerald Vane had departed almost immediately, with the air of a man who has received a verdict on something he had always half suspected, and requires solitude to absorb it properly. Mrs. Crail showed us out herself, and at the door she paused for a moment in the cold November air, with her hand on the latch, and looked at Holmes with an expression that contained, in nearly equal measure, relief, and the residue of something older and heavier that relief had not entirely displaced. "He is a good man," she said. It was not a defence exactly. It was more in the nature of a fact she wished entered into the record. "I know he is," Holmes replied, with a simplicity that I think surprised her. That was always the most interesting thing about the case. We walked to the main road in silence. The early dark of November had settled fully over the city. Dawn, the street lamps made pale aureoles in the damp air. I turned the events of the afternoon over in my mind with the particular quality of reflection that follows a case's resolution. Not satisfaction, precisely, but a kind of sober stock-taking of what had been found and what it cost. "What will happen to him?" I asked, when we had found a cab and were moving northward through the lamplit streets. Holmes was quiet for a moment. "That will depend on several things. The Crown will weigh the fraud against the circumstances, the original wrong, Vane's own recorded acknowledgement of it, Merridew's evident intention to restore rather than to profit. These are not trivial considerations, and a court possessed of any equity will take them seriously." He looked out at the passing city. "There are also the practical complications, and Prentice's near prosecution will reflect poorly on those who assembled that case. Lestrade is not a vindictive man, and I think he understands that his own handling of the matter will be scrutinised alongside Merridew's conduct. That awareness tends to produce a certain measured quality in official proceedings." "And Reeve?" I said. His reaction to your mention of photographic ink analysis. Does that implicate him in the original scheme? It implicates him in knowledge, Holmes said carefully. Reeve knew, or strongly suspected, that the document had been altered before it reached him. His reaction to the prospect of ink analysis was the reaction of a man who feared that a specific discovery was about to be made, not because he had made the alteration, but because he had chosen, for reasons of his own, not to report what he suspected. Whether that constitutes a legal liability or merely a professional failure is a question I leave to others. A brief pause. He struck me, throughout, as a man who had found himself in the unfortunate position of knowing too much and acting on too little. It is a more common condition than one might wish. We said nothing further on the matter until we had reached Baker Street and climbed the familiar stairs to our sitting room, where Mrs. Hudson had kept the fire up against the November chill and left the supper things arranged with her customary foresight. Holmes dropped into his armchair with the particular quality of settled fatigue that I had observed at the conclusion of cases. Not the fatigue of physical exertion, but the distinctive weariness of a mind that has been operating at sustained intensity and has now, with deliberate decision, released its hold on the problem. I poured 2 glasses of whisky and set one on the small table beside him. He did not reach for it immediately. The thing that will stay with me about this case, I said, settling into my own chair, is not the crime itself, nor even the ingenuity of its execution. It is the figure of Merridew, the patience of it. 40 years of his family's dispossession, carrying that knowledge, watching that house sit in the hands of the man who had taken it, and then when the opportunity finally presented itself, conducting the restoration with such methodical, unhurried precision. It is not uncommon, Holmes said, for the most carefully planned acts to be motivated by the oldest grievances. Time does not diminish certain injuries, it organises them. He reached for his glass at last and held it without drinking. What I found genuinely remarkable about Merridew was not the plan. The plan, though well executed, followed a recognisable pattern, but the sincerity. He never, at any point in our acquaintance, behaved as a guilty man, not because he was a skilled dissembler, though he had that quality, but because he did not, in any recess of himself, feel guilty. He had satisfied his own moral court entirely. The legal one was, to his mind, a lesser jurisdiction. Is he wrong? I asked. Holmes looked at me with the measured attention he reserved for questions he considered genuinely worth the effort of answering. He is wrong in his method, and right in his grievance. The law cannot accommodate that distinction as comfortably as individual conscience can. It must deal in acts rather than in the moral histories behind them, because the moment it begins to adjudicate between grievances of varying antiquity and complexity, it ceases to function as law and becomes something else entirely, something considerably more susceptible to the particular sympathies of whoever happens to be sitting in judgment. He drank. Which does not mean the distinction is without value. It means only that the law is not its proper custodian. I considered this for a time. The fire settled in the grate with a small domestic sound. Somewhere below, the street was going about its evening business with the indifferent continuity that London maintains through all circumstances, great and small. Vane recorded his own wrong, I said. That seems to me the strangest element of the whole affair. A man who would take a property through dishonest means, and then ascribe his own acknowledgement of the dishonesty into the legal record of the transaction. Men are rarely consistent, Holmes replied. Vane was capable of the acquisition and capable of the shame. That he was not capable in life of translating the shame into restitution speaks to a very ordinary human failure. The preference for feeling correct over acting correctly. He wanted the notation there. It absolved him, in some private fashion, one of the need to do anything more substantial. His gaze moved to the fire. Merridew simply decided that absolution without action was insufficient, and so he acted. We sat in companionable silence after that, as we had sat through many such evenings over the years, the fire, the whisky, the particular quality of Baker Street quiet that had come to feel, to me, like one of the more reliable fixtures of existence. Holmes did not speak again for some time. When he did, it was with the reflective, slightly distant tone that I had come to associate with thoughts offered not for discussion, but simply to be placed in the air between us and allowed to find their own level. Reason, he said, is a sufficient instrument for arriving at the truth. I have never found it otherwise. But I have also never found it sufficient alone, for determining what truth obliges us to do. That requires something additional, something which varies between persons and is not reducible to logic, however much one might wish it were. He was quiet for a moment. I am not always certain what to call that something. I am, however, consistently certain that it exists. He reached forward and set his empty glass on the table with a small final sound. Outside, London continued in its habitual and magnificent indifference. The Bloomsbury house stood in its quiet street as it had stood for decades, changed in ownership, changed in the record of its obligations, unchanged in brick and mortar, and the mute persistence of old walls that have held more history than any single generation of their inhabitants ever fully knows. Whether the law would find a measure of justice adequate to its complexities, I could not say. Holmes, I think, did not expect it to. He had, as was his custom, placed the truth where it could be examined and left the rest to those whose business it properly was. It was, he had once remarked to me, the only honest division of labour he had ever found.